Hello, and welcome to this episode of Inside Legal ESG. My name is Pam Cone, and I'm delighted to serve as the host for this podcast series. Today, we are so honored to have with us Shelly Gilberg, who is the ESG Markets Leader at PWC Canada. Welcome, Shelley.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Pamela.
So for those of our listeners who have attended Legal ESG Toronto or Legal ESG New York, you may remember Shelley as one of our brilliant speakers there. We're going to have a lot to talk about today. So let's start with, tell me about your practice and your role at PWC Canada, and how did you get there? Tell us a little bit about your career progression.
Well, I will try to give you the short version
Okay.
for your listeners. But interestingly enough, I actually started my career on the social side. So working in jails, working with kids and families, community services, social work, basically. However, I'm also a CPA who has spent over half my career on the industry side. So as a CFO, a COO, leading technology and strategy, and then a tremendous amount of time helping clients use technology to get at some of their transformations. So in terms of how I came to the practice that I do at PwC, I would say I came to it a little bit late in my career, to be honest, and it's a function of a lot of different pieces of my career. As far as the part of sustainability that I practice in, I spend most of my time with boards and executive teams, really actually trying to help them bring sustainability back to business basics. I've been blessed at PwC we have a really long-standing practice in sustainability, long before it was cool, and everybody wanted to do it. And when I came to PwC, what I found was we had amazing technical depth. We have phenomenal engineers on decarbonization. We have excellent reporting and standards professionals. What the clients were looking for and what wasn't happening in the market was actually making that translatable to the non-sustainability executives on the management team and boards, and creating some common language and really kind of integrating sustainability with the rest of the business. So I feel privileged to have that role with our clients and to have such a strong group of technical and deeply expert professionals on all the other things that clients need around sustainability.
You mentioned that you do a lot of work with boards and executive teams. Are you seeing boards and executive teams coming to the realization that this isn't just a side project, but it actually has to be embedded in the way they run their business? Or is it still sort of an afterthought?
Well, I think that depends a little bit, Pam. I would say for the large public companies I work with, they're just drowning in regulated disclosure requirements right now, which unfortunately, there's only so much bandwidth in every organization, is consuming a lot of time and a lot of resources. There are some forward-thinking organizations that I think are sort of really demonstrating kind of some leading practice and thinking on this, who are seeing it as integral to the business. But I think that latter group is doing a couple things differently. One, they're truly being very thoughtful about what is material. They're not trying to produce, 200 activities in sustainability areas. They're looking and saying, really, what do our customers care about? What do our financial stakeholders care about? What do our employees care about? What do the communities we operate in care about? Not just social license to operate, but they are truly doing materiality analysis on what's material to our stakeholders, but what's material to our business. And the companies that do that, I won't say it's automatic, but they set themselves up well to understand if that's really that important to the business, it can't be a small sustainability team that is driving that. Which part of the business is making those decisions, taking those actions day to day that are going to influence success on that material issue, topic, practice, process, whatever it is. So I think it is a little bit of a tale of, two different kinds of companies right now.
Well, and I would think that if they are focusing on what is most material, it makes it a little bit more manageable too, because they're not trying to be everything, all things to all people, but rather we're going to focus on these two areas because that's where we can have the greatest impact or make the biggest difference, or that's what's most material to us.
Correct. And I think they do a third thing, which is when they make the list a little bit smaller in terms of what's truly material and how they should be thinking and acting on those things, they allocate the right capital, operating human capital. They put the right sort of performance monitoring frameworks in. They're not looking at those things once a year, 3 months after year end. They're looking at those material topics at a frequency level that actually makes sense for being able to influence, course correct, and monitor. And with that smaller list, they're actually able to do that.
Right. I hope I live long enough to see the day where these topics are actually discussed with as much frequency as reviewing financial returns on a quarterly basis or a monthly basis, and the interim reports, so that progress is measured, to your point, more than just once a year when it shows up on the board agenda once a year. So you've hit on this a little bit when you talked about the drowning with regulatory requirements, but what are you seeing as the hottest topics or issues right now with ESG? I noticed on your LinkedIn profile, you put what's top of mind right now for C-suite is ESG, the regulatory tidal wave, and tech. Talk a little bit about those three areas and frankly, how they intertwine.
It's interesting. I find that particularly in the conversations with the board and executive teams, those three things tend to intersect really frequently. So sustainability / ESG, very, very top of mind. The regulatory tidal wave, a portion of that is ESG, but the other thing that the majority of the companies that I spend time with are grappling with is there's also a massive taxation regulatory tidal wave change in a lot of jurisdictions. So that's, top of their agenda for a whole bunch of really good reasons. And where technology plays, in some cases, the questions will be about, well, can generative AI help us with this? But truly tackling any of these things at scale, it's not necessarily tech-led, but in a lot of cases, it needs to be technology enabled. When you think about how are you going to measure and manage performance on some of these items on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour, week-to-week, month-to-month basis, you probably don't want to be doing that with Excel spreadsheets with things hand-bombed into them. So I find that the three topics tend to converge pretty frequently.
Well, and particularly with some of the regulatory requirements, including third-party, either limited or reasonable assurance, they're going to have some sort of tech platform that's managing all this data. And to your point, Excel spreadsheets isn't going to cut the mustard.
Yeah, and Excel spreadsheets make it difficult to prove that you have the right kind of separation of duties and controls around the data, the same way we'd expect to have on financial data. This data, when it's being publicly disclosed and it's the basis of executive compensation, or it's part of how you're positioning your product, your services, those attributes of having a good controls framework around it and technology being part of that story, I think they definitely go hand in hand, Pam.
So as long as we're talking about regulations, we're recording this in mid to late October, and just a few weeks ago, Canada announced some climate disclosure regulations. Tell us a little bit about that. What's happening in your home country?
Well, I wish our home country were a little faster on some of this.
Yeah,
I think
you and I both.
yeah, well, I think it puts Canadian businesses at a disadvantage unless they're really sort of early adopters and voluntarily being out there ahead of the curve. So I am a little bit disappointed by that, but pleased to see that it's finally coming. I would say on a scale or a continuum of where does the Canadian disclosure standards sort of sit relative to other jurisdictions, it is closer to the SEC. It is not as strong as California or as far-reaching. Definitely not as far-reaching and in terms of expectations and comprehensiveness as the CSRD, for example. I think what you'll see is it's modeled very heavily, like many jurisdictions, on the ISSB work and the TCFD framework. So should be a lot of surprises for anybody that's familiar with those. What we have seen in the drafts to date are there will be a year transition period around scope 3. And that still will come with a bit of a comply or explain. So there's some language in there around if it is, too onerous in terms of cost or complexity to collect that data. There's some sort of escape hatches in legislation. But the other piece of legislation regulation that has been concerning to some of the Canadian businesses is the updates to the greenwashing regulations here. And what I think is interesting about that particular piece of legislation is, number one, actions can actually be brought by private parties. So it doesn't have to be the Office of the Competition Commissioner that says, hey, we're not sure that what you said is totally true. So private parties can bring action, which I think for certain sectors represents a lot of concern. Second thing is it's reverse onus. So the party bringing the action or the commissioner doesn't have to prove you were wrong. You have to prove that you had a valid, internationally recognized sort of approach to making the environmental or climate claims that you're making. So I think we're expecting to see, not dissimilar to the US, Pam, that the majority of the litigation going on right now is more greenwashing oriented than anything else.
And so given the description of the new regs around greenwashing, are those stronger regs than you're seeing like out of the EU or certainly out of the US, yes, but out of the EU or the UK?
I don't think so. I think they're on par. I think there's some uniqueness to the sort of the private actor portion of it, but no, I think they're relatively consistent. And interestingly, it's not like this is net new legislation or regulation, but the updates, I think, around the process surprised some people. Like we've always had regulation and legislation that says you shouldn't say things that aren't true about your product and your services. That's been around for a while.
So what do you think is in store for the rest of 2024 and perhaps throughout 2025? What's on your horizon? What are you spotting?
Well, maybe I'll share a couple trends we didn't touch on yet, Pam, and then what's my what would I be willing to bet you a bottle of wine on for 24 to 25? So on the trend side, we talked CSRD, the European regulations, which actually impact a lot of North American businesses that fall under that CLIP level, both public and private companies, and the double materiality work that CSRD requires companies to do, definitely a substantial trend. Second, I would say is your point around an increased trend towards limited and reasonable assurance. Some of that's regulatory, but there's also a lot of pressure coming from boards where there's executive compensation involved on those metrics. Third, I would say a relatively cautious approach from companies to nature and biodiversity commitments and goals. We had a lot of companies come out of the gate hard during COVID around, making statements about net zero and 2030. They're definitely taking a more measured approach to nature and biodiversity, which is arguably also more complex as well. The other trend that I would say is I'm starting to see companies internally, not necessarily externally, take a hard look at their 2030 targets and whether they're going to need to make some changes to those. Are they going to be achievable? And maybe with that backdrop, that kind of leads me to what I think the rest of 24 is just about over in my world at October the 23rd, but 24 and 25, I think you're going to continue to see regulation really driving the public companies and in a lot of cases, private companies. If you look at California's legislation, you look at the CSRD, that's not limited to public companies. That will include privates. Private companies that aren't affected by that, I think, are still going to be driven in some cases by the regulation if they're part of the value chain for public companies.
And most companies are part of the value chain of some other company, right? So to your point that the Canadian rules are more in line with the SEC rules, and you've heard me say this before, at this point, it's almost immaterial what the SEC ends up doing because most companies are already having to comply to CSRD or certainly the coming California regs, because either they apply directly to the company or the company is part of the supply chain, the value chain of a company that does need to report. So it really is companies, it would be in their best interest to shoot for the CSRD, and that way have everything else covered, rather than just comply with whatever the SEC eventually issues or enacts, and then still have to do CSRD on top of that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think the scope and the depth of what the CSRD expectations are is pretty intimidating for a lot of companies, but I agree, if you're going to be subject to that regime at some point, then starting on that process now makes a ton of sense, because it is from my perspective sort of the highest, hardest bar in the regulatory frameworks right now. But I think we're going to see a couple other things happen. One is I do think, partly driven by the regulation, but I think it's actually being driven more by the litigation. I think you're going to see a lot more rigor, not just on the disclosures, because I think, the legal profession and, chief compliance officers, CLOs do a very good job of making sure those public disclosures and filings are very accurate. But I think what we're seeing, and we're going to continue to see this more, is that is going to extend into the marketing realm and much more rigor on the statements that get made and don't necessarily hit the chief legal officer's desk or the chief compliance officer's desk. I think we'll see a lot of that. The third thing, which is a little bit more economic, but I think we'll start to see this potentially towards the tail end of 25, is I think you're going to see high quality carbon credits and offsets get very expensive as companies start to sort of revisit the road to their 2030 commitments. And I think, sadly, some of the research that we've done on this with the WEF and other organizations is there aren't enough high quality carbon credits and offsets on the planet to make up the gap on the 2030 targets for some of the technologies that aren't available at scale or economically yet. That I think we're going to see that trend start to kick in towards the end of 25.
And then what?
Right? Exactly.
So, given everything we've talked about and all the challenges that are on the horizon for us, I always like to ask one final question of my guests. What gives you hope in this challenging environment?
So a number of things give me hope, Pamela, and I'm glad you asked that question, because sometimes it can seem a bit sort of like doom and gloom and overwhelming, and not necessarily enough kind of positives to focus on. But I think the professionalization of sustainability, not just as practitioners, but into organizations over the last 3 years has dramatically changed. I am encouraged by how many companies have multidisciplinary management teams around these topics and issues. Not just 3 years ago, people were all excited to say, I have a chief sustainability officer. I think the leading practice in the bar has moved on that when I meet with companies that regularly have a cross-functional management team meeting on how are we doing on these issues, are we resourcing them well enough, where do they intersect across our business functions, that gives me a lot of encouragement. And seeing sustainability at the table. I'm encouraged by the partnerships that I see emerging, particularly between sort of the risk functions and the finance functions and sustainability teams. I think that is really positive. I think that will give sustainability a different language that resonates with the management team and the board. But I think the finance and risk teams are also learning the sustainability language as well. I think that bodes well. I am very encouraged by the number of both sort of new entrants to the job market that want to be focused on sustainability and making a difference, as well as mid-career professionals and senior executives that are actually embracing it and saying, you know what, if I, as the CEO, am not the chief sustainability steward, this isn't going to work.
Right.
So
Right.
I think the kind of talent and the volume of the talent that's coalescing around some of these hard problems is very positive from my perspective. And as much as I've been quoted and given a hard time more than once for saying, you know, I don't like that the regulatory focus is taking attention off of actually improving performance.
Right.
But I am encouraged that as the regulatory framework gets into place, that really, in my mind, kind of creates a level playing field that then will let companies start to focus on performance once they've got the disclosure muscles and machinery and processes built. So I look forward to that next phase of this, where with that in hand, now organizations can actually start to focus on what am I doing and am I achieving the outcomes and the performance and the impacts I want to have.
Yes, and I think you're absolutely right. It feels right now that so much time, energy, and resources is being focused on the reporting function rather than the doing function. But hopefully, once that system and platform is in place, then we can actually get back to focus on the doing, and the reporting is an afterthought, not the driver.
Yeah. I
Thank you so much.
100% agree. Well,
I'm
thank you
so excited to have you with us today, and I'm sure our audience will enjoy hearing from you. So again, thank you for your time and your insights today.
Oh, I thoroughly enjoyed the discussion, Pamela. So thank you for the opportunity and the interesting questions and the opportunity to sort of share some of this more broadly with your audience. So thank you.
We could talk about this for hours, so I may have you back. We'll finish this conversation. Thank you so much.